Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished listeners, today we address a major geopolitical and economic disruption, the sudden cancellation of the U.S. trade delegation's scheduled visit to New Delhi this August 25th to 29th, intended to advance the long-sought bilateral trade agreement, or BTA. This postponement comes just days before sweeping tariffs up to 50% are poised to take effect. It's more than an inconvenience. It's a signal that India's economic relationship, once aspirational, now stands at a critical juncture. As we explore this development, we'll unpack its genesis, implications, and what it reveals about India's strategic resilience. The trade relationship between India and the United States has long been described as one of strategic convergence, but also one of recurring frustrations. Both countries recognize each other as critical partners in the global economy, yet for decades they have struggled to overcome a series of trade disagreements. The most recent effort, the Bilateral Trade Agreement, BTA negotiations, was meant to be a breakthrough moment. The push for the BTA really accelerated in 2023 and 2024, when both governments publicly committed to raising bilateral trade from roughly $200 billion to $500 billion by the year 2030. Prime Minister Narendra Modi's state visit to Washington was marketed as a turning point, where the two democracies pledged to unlock economic opportunities alongside their growing defense and technology partnerships. Optimism was high. Indian negotiators highlighted openings in areas like clean energy, pharmaceuticals, textiles, and digital services, while U.S. officials emphasized agricultural access, manufacturing exports, and intellectual property rights. The core hope on India's side was straightforward access to the world's largest consumer market. By gaining a fairer trade deal, India could accelerate domestic modernization, boost exports, and attract global supply chains moving away from China. Washington, meanwhile, sought to secure a more level playing field for American businesses in India, particularly in sectors such as agriculture, dairy, medical devices, and digital commerce. But beneath this optimism, long-standing structural problems surfaced again. Agriculture became the first and most stubborn stumbling block. The United States insisted on greater market access for American dairy and farm products. India, with nearly half of its population dependent on farming, could not risk opening the floodgates to heavily subsidized imports that might devastate rural livelihoods. For Indian negotiators, agricultural protection is not only an economic necessity, but a political red line. Any compromise threatens millions of small farmers and the food security narrative. Another point of contention was India's energy policy. Since the outbreak of the Ukraine conflict, India has increased imports of discounted Russian crude oil, arguing that it is an economic lifeline during global price shocks. The U.S., however, views this as undercutting Western sanctions. While Washington tolerated it quietly for months, trade negotiations made it harder to separate energy disagreements from economic cooperation. The optics of India maintaining a strategic autonomy line while asking for concessions in Washington did not sit well with the Trump administration. By early 2025, tensions had risen further. U.S. President Donald Trump, in a dramatic move, announced a new round of reciprocal tariffs, 25% initially, followed quickly by an additional 25%. Together, these created an unprecedented 50% tariff wall against Indian exports. For context, this placed India in the same tariff bracket as adversarial economies, not strategic partners. The move shocked many in New Delhi, as it came while formal negotiations were still active. Indian officials argued that these tariffs undermined trust and violated the spirit of partnership, especially when other U.S. allies in Europe continued trading with Russia without similar penalties. Still, Washington remained firm. Trade for the U.S. was now a pressure tool, not simply an economic instrument. The background to this canceled August round of negotiations, therefore, is not just about technical disagreements on tariffs or market access. It reflects a broader clash. India's insistence on strategic autonomy versus Washington's expectation of strategic alignment. These unresolved tensions between hope and mistrust, between ambition and political realities, set the stage for the collapse of momentum in August 2025. The cancellation of the August trade talks between India and the United States is not merely a scheduling adjustment. It is a deeply symbolic setback that reflects the growing mistrust between the two largest democracies. What was supposed to be a constructive dialogue aimed at bridging gaps in tariffs, market access, and regulatory hurdles has now turned into a diplomatic standoff, exposing the fragility of this economic partnership. So, what exactly happened? According to reports, negotiators on both sides were already struggling to finalize even a draft framework before the scheduled talks. India wanted assurances that American tariffs would be rolled back or at least suspended while discussions continued. From New Delhi's perspective, entering talks under the pressure of a 50% tariff regime would make them look weak, both domestically and internationally. On the other hand, Washington insisted that tariffs were leverage necessary to compel India to make concessions on agriculture, e-commerce, and energy policy. Neither side budged. The result was predictable. The talks were called off just days before the Trump-Putin summit, with Washington citing lack of progress and India framing it as an issue of dignity and fairness. Why does this matter? First, the cancellation disrupts what was once considered the fastest-growing trade relationship in the world. Bilateral trade had been expanding at double-digit rates, giving India access to investment and technology while providing U.S. businesses with a vast and growing market. The sudden freeze threatens to reverse this momentum. Already, industries in both countries are nervous. Indian exporters of textiles, steel, and IT services worry about losing competitiveness in the U.S. market, while American producers of machinery and farm goods fear retaliation from India. Second, the cancellation reveals the limits of trust in the broader strategic partnership. For years, leaders in both capitals have celebrated their relationship as a natural alliance between two democracies, facing common challenges from balancing China in the Indo-Pacific to countering terrorism. Yet, when it comes to trade, the same leaders find themselves unable to compromise. If trade talks can collapse so easily, it raises doubts about how reliable the partnership truly is under pressure. Third, timing is everything. These talks were scheduled just ahead of the Trump-Putin summit, an event closely watched worldwide. For Washington, showing toughness on India could serve as a signal of consistency, would not appear weak before sitting across from Vladimir Putin. But for New Delhi, the optics are disastrous. It creates the impression that India is being sidelined while Washington prioritizes Moscow. Such an image undermines India's global positioning and complicates Prime Minister Modi's domestic narrative of India as an equal partner to great powers. Finally, the cancellation matters because it directly impacts ordinary people. Farmers in India now worry about losing subsidies if U.S. pressure resumes. Small exporters face uncertainty about access to their largest market. Even consumers are affected. Higher tariffs on American goods in India mean costlier products, from smartphones to advanced medical equipment. On the U.S. side, businesses that were eyeing India as an alternative to China may now hesitate, slowing down diversification efforts that Washington itself has been encouraging. In short, the collapse of these talks is not just about trade policy, it is about trust, timing, and the future of global alignments. It signals to the world that even close partners like India and the U.S. can stumble badly when economic nationalism collides with strategic ambition. Whenever global diplomacy hits a stumbling block, the first and sharpest reactions often come from within each country. The cancellation of the August trade talks between India and the United States has been no exception. Both nations have seen strong domestic responses from politicians, business leaders, farmers, and the media interpreting the event in their own way. In India, the mood has been one of frustration but also defiance. Many Indian officials framed the cancellation as a moment where India stood firm against external pressure. Prime Minister Modi, who has built his political image around the themes of sovereignty and self-reliance, quickly emphasized that India would not be bullied into submission. This message plays well with his core supporters, especially rural constituencies and farmers, who fear that opening up to American agricultural imports would hurt their livelihoods. Farmers' unions were particularly vocal, saying that protecting India's markets is essential for food security and rural stability. The ruling Bharatiya Janata Party (BJP) amplified this message, presenting the cancellation not as a setback, but as evidence that India refuses to compromise its dignity. At the same time, India's business community has shown concern. Exporters of textiles, pharmaceuticals, and IT services worry that losing preferential access to U.S. markets could cause long-term damage. Some of India's leading industry chambers issued cautious statements urging both governments to return to the negotiating table quickly. They warned that uncertainty in trade policy discourages investment, both foreign and domestic. The Indian media reflected this divide, while nationalist outlets hailed Modi for standing up to Washington. Business-focused publications stressed the risks of prolonged tension. In the United States, reactions were also split. The Trump administration and its supporters framed the cancellation as proof of Trump's hardline stance on trade. For them, walking away from talks was a show of strength, signaling that Washington will not compromise unless its terms are met. Some Republican voices even compared it to Trump's tough tactics with China, arguing that consistency across trade partners reinforces us leverage globally. However, American business groups were far less enthusiastic. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce, along with associations representing agricultural exporters and tech companies, expressed disappointment. India is one of the fastest-growing consumer markets in the world, and American companies fear losing ground to competitors from Europe or China if the U.S.-India relationship sours. Farmers in the Midwest, who already face trade difficulties with China, now worry that India's retaliation could make things worse. For them, the cancellation means yet another potential market slipping away. Political opponents of Trump seized on the moment to criticize his unpredictable trade policy. Democrats argued that the administration's tariff-first approach isolates allies and undermines America's credibility as a partner. They pointed out that India, far from being an adversary, is a strategic ally in Asia, and alienating it over tariffs makes little sense when Washington is simultaneously seeking partners to balance China. The media narratives in the U.S. reflected these divides. Conservative outlets portrayed the cancellation as a bold negotiating tactic, while liberal commentators framed it as yet another example of self-inflicted damage. For the average American, though, the issue remained abstract. Trade with India is not as visible as trade with China or Mexico. Still, rising prices for certain imports and potential losses in farm exports could soon bring the consequences closer to home. In summary, the domestic reactions in both India and the United States highlight the political tightrope leaders must walk. Modi must reassure his citizens that he is defending farmers and sovereignty, while also keeping India's economic growth on track. Trump, meanwhile, must convince his supporters that his tough approach delivers results, even as businesses and farmers grow increasingly restless. What emerges is a picture of two democracies caught between nationalism and pragmatism, where leaders are constrained by domestic pressures just as much as by international realities. The cancellation of the U.S.-India trade talks did not go unnoticed on the global stage. International observers, governments, and businesses quickly reacted, recognizing that when two of the world's largest economies clash, the ripple effects extend far beyond their borders. This moment has implications not only for trade but also for geopolitics, alliances, and the future balance of power in Asia and beyond. Global markets were among the first to respond. Investors, already on edge from U.S.-China trade disputes, viewed the breakdown of U.S.-India talks as another sign of rising protectionism. Stock exchanges in Asia registered slight dips, while oil and commodity markets saw increased volatility. The perception is that global trade is entering an era of instability, where even friendly nations cannot avoid disputes. In Europe, policymakers reacted with a mixture of caution and opportunity. The European Union has long sought to expand its own trade relationship with India, and the cancellation with Washington may open new doors. Brussels sees a chance to present itself as a more stable, reliable partner at a time when America is seen as unpredictable under Trump. Some European companies, especially in technology, pharmaceuticals, and renewable energy, have already signaled interest in filling the vacuum left by stalled U.S.-India talks. However, European leaders also worry that rising tariffs globally could weaken demand and fuel a broader slowdown in world trade. China's reaction has been particularly strategic. Beijing is closely watching the friction between Washington and New Delhi. On the one hand, China benefits when U.S. allies like India feel alienated by American policies, because it creates space for Beijing to strengthen its own ties with them. Already, Chinese media outlets have suggested that India should not put all its eggs in one American basket, and instead consider deeper trade cooperation with China. On the other hand, China is wary. A weaker U.S.-India relationship could drive India closer to other Western allies like Japan and Australia, strengthening the Indo-Pacific security framework that Beijing opposes. In short, China sees opportunity but also risk. In Asia more broadly, countries such as Japan, South Korea, and members of ASEAN are analyzing the fallout carefully. These nations see the U.S.-India partnership as a cornerstone of regional stability and counterbalance to China. A weakening of that relationship could complicate their own strategic calculations. Japan, in particular, has invested heavily in trilateral and quadrilateral forums with India and the U.S., and fears that trade rifts could spill over into security cooperation. Developing nations are also watching closely. Many countries in Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia face similar dilemmas as India, balancing national sovereignty and self-reliance with the need for access to U.S. markets. For them, India's defiance may be inspiring, a sign that even a major economy can resist U.S. pressure. At the same time, they worry that if trade wars expand, global demand for their exports could shrink, hurting their fragile economies. Strategically, the cancellation raises broader questions about the future of globalization. Are we entering a phase where national interests and domestic politics override decades of free trade consensus? If so, alliances and partnerships will need to be rethought. India, for instance, may diversify its trade partners, seeking closer ties with the EU, Russia, and regional neighbors. The U.S., meanwhile, risks ceding influence if allies increasingly view it as unreliable. Another implication lies in defense and security cooperation. While the dispute is officially about tariffs, it cannot be separated from the larger U.S.-India strategic partnership. If trade tensions linger, they may erode trust in areas like defense procurement, intelligence sharing, and coordination in the Indo-Pacific. For allies such as Australia, this is concerning. A fracture between Washington and New Delhi would weaken collective efforts to counterbalance China's rise. The global media has captured this tension well. Headlines around the world frame the cancellation as more than a simple economic dispute. European newspapers emphasize the decline of U.S. credibility. Asian outlets analyze the risks to regional balance, and Middle Eastern commentators link the issue to energy flows and oil demand. Across the board, the dominant theme has been uncertainty and unpredictable future, where trade can no longer be assumed to follow stable rules. In conclusion, the global reactions to the canceled trade talks underscore just how interconnected our world has become. What might seem like a bilateral dispute between Washington and New Delhi actually reverberates across Europe, Asia, Africa, and beyond. The strategic implications are profound: shifting alliances, economic recalculations, and a questioning of the very foundations of globalization. Both the US and India must now decide whether short-term political gain is worth long-term geopolitical risk. When the US canceled its scheduled trade talks with India, it was more than just a diplomatic signal. It carried direct and measurable economic consequences for both sides. Trade, after all, is not an abstract concept but a lifeline for industries, farmers, workers, and consumers. The dispute brings both immediate challenges and long-term risks, shaping how India and the United States adjust their economic strategies. For India, the impact is especially significant because of its export reliance on the U.S. market. America is India's largest trading partner, buying billions of dollars worth of goods annually, from textiles and pharmaceuticals to information technology, services, and agricultural products. The cancellation of talks creates uncertainty for exporters who depend on predictable access to the U.S. market. Small and medium enterprises, in particular, fear rising tariffs or tighter regulations that could price them out of competition. Pharmaceuticals stand out as one of the most sensitive sectors. Indian drug makers supply affordable generic medicines to the U.S., a trade worth billions of dollars and vital to American healthcare. Any disruption here would hurt Indian producers and raise costs for American patients. Similarly, India's thriving IT services industry, outsourcing software, and back-office support could face political headwinds in Washington if trade tensions deepen, threatening one of India's most globally competitive sectors. Agriculture is another critical front. Indian farmers already face domestic challenges, from low incomes to unpredictable monsoons and U.S. tariffs on farm exports like rice. Sugar or spices would only add pressure. Prime Minister Modi's vow to protect farmers gains urgency in this context. Trade instability directly affects rural livelihoods. For a government that relies heavily on farmer support, this is not just an economic issue but also a political one. In conclusion, the political ramifications of the canceled trade talks extend far beyond tariffs and trade balances. For Modi, it tests his promises to farmers and his vision of self-reliance. For American leaders, it touches on electoral politics, voter concerns, and strategic credibility. In both democracies, trade has become a political battlefield. And the outcome of this dispute will shape not only economic policies, but also the political fortunes of those in power. In closing, this development is a setback, but not a full derailment. It's a test of India's strategic autonomy and economic agency. India has weathered storms before. With resilience, diversified partnerships, and smart diplomacy, it can adapt and thrive, vision intact.